There are no men's refuges. Why? When we know, academically, we know that the figures between men and women hitting each other, killing each other, abusing each other are equal. It isn't a numbers game. If you grow up in a violent family, if you're lucky enough, you'll transcend. But most don't. They go on to repeat the patterns they've learned in early childhood.
The definition of domestic and family violence, that can be hitting, punching, pushing, stabbing, that sort of physical abuse. Sexual violence and abuse, emotional abuse, economic and financial abuse, property damage, violence towards pets, social isolation, cutting off someone from their friends and family, spiritual abuse. So it's wide spectrum of abusive behaviours designed to dominate and control the other person.
In Australia, you don't have to be physically abused. You don't have to have any evidence of physical abuse to make an accusation of domestic violence. It's enough to say you fear violence could occur. And then you can get a violence protection order. You can get your husband removed from the house, often not see his children for years on end.
Domestic abuse, domestic violence has been so broadly defined that it's impossible to have intimacy with someone without committing domestic violence. And the Duluth model, as well as the Istanbul Convention, totally disregard men as victims of domestic violence.
About 70% across the 32 different countries that were assessed, and these were on all the continents, about 70% is non-self-defensive, bilateral. You're hitting each other. That's the true face of domestic violence. Very rarely do you have one person who's the victim. The vast majority of the time, both people are the perpetrators, and you could also say both are the victims.
It's very confusing when we talk about female perpetrators, because we've had like nearly 50 years of research showing women are just as likely to instigate physical violence as men are. In fact, they're more likely to start off, the slap on the face, just pushing him, shoving him, whatever it is.
Women kill men, so it's not a gender issue. And my mother used to scream and cry, but it was me she beat because I looked like my father. So I knew it intimately firsthand. That's why I knew it wasn't a gender issue, because my mother was a great deal more violent than my father.
The first time that she assaulted me with her fist was when we were in the bedroom again and in bed having an argument. And she just came after me with her fist suddenly towards my face. And so then I'm shocked because that's the first instance of her coming after me with her fist. So then I just tried to restrain her and get out of the room. So I took her wrists and was kind of blocking the punches and restraining her, and then needed to exit the room. And that's when I first realized, oh my gosh, I'm in a relationship and this is domestic violence.
Well, men kill 4,000 wives every year in domestic violence. Women kill 3,000 husbands every year. In addition, half the time that men are killing their wives, they're acting in self-defense, because women initiate 70% of domestic violence.
About 24.3% of women will experience severe domestic violence in their life, about 13.8% of males. But interestingly, 29.4% of lesbians. So again, we've the highest rate experienced is women in a lesbian relationship, and not surprisingly, the lowest rate is men in a gay relationship at 16.4%.
It's always been interesting how the feminists have absolutely denied the fact that lesbians have one of the highest rates of domestic violence, because it mucks up their narrative. I mean, it's not about dangerous men when you have two women together. And why it is that women have these problematic levels of physical abuse in their relationships, I don't really know. But it certainly doesn't conform to what we're told. And that's why those figures are very carefully hushed up.
I was asleep and I woke up and she was on top of me. It's very, very difficult for some people to understand, because I guess it could be almost like a fantasy for some men to wake up this way. But when you're in a really complex relationship, and within that relationship you're not happy, it isn't a fantasy. It's more of like a nightmare, really.
The the most important thing is, as I keep saying, you're lucky if you've got a bruise. You're lucky if you've got a broken bone, because at least you can prove what's been done to you. But there's so many, this grey army of men and women who are horribly abused, but no one's going to believe them.
Certainly to my awareness here in the UK, I don't think there's ever been a national campaign backed by the London Mayor, by our government, by anything that encourages male victims to disclose. We've had a lot of effort and energy going into helping female victims disclose, a lot of energy and effort going into strategies for girls and women, and a lot of energy and effort going into giving boys and men the message that you're not good enough and need to be better. And I think, again, what does that lean towards? Boys and men are perpetrators, girls and women are victims, and that is the narrative.
Through the experience of violence from my ex-wife, the 18-month period where there were multiple attacks, it was quite difficult for me to figure out who to talk to and whether to talk to anyone about it. She worked for a very prestigious organization in Seattle. So, her reputational damage would have been really bad.
I did feel very, very sorry for her. And I did make excuses for her for a lot of the time. A lot of her behaviors I excused, and I didn't say really anything to any of my family members while it was going on. I was so tied down in this relationship, I felt like it had to work.
If a male victim believes that, disclosing what's happened, saying I need some help and support, I need to do something about it, or acknowledging, look, I'm been abused here. If he believes on some level that's a threat to his sense of self, his sense of masculinity, then he might not say anything.
Then the internal barriers that men often face are more about the challenges that admitting that they're a victim brings to their sense of manhood. So that things like shame, embarrassment, social stigma. A lot of men think, well, I'm a victim of violence from my female partner. Am I alone? Am I the only guy like this? I've never heard of men being victims. So maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm less of a man. Maybe I'm weak. Maybe I'm wimpy. Maybe I'll be laughed at or ridiculed or teased. Maybe they feel ashamed at being unable to protect themselves or losing the independence that comes when your life's being controlled. One of my favorite quotes comes from Warren Farrell, who's an American author who writes a lot about men's issues and gender issues. And he says, men's greatest weakness is their facade of strength, and women's greatest strength is their facade of weakness.
Accusing someone of rape is an act of violence. It's designed to provoke violence against the person you're accusing. And we need to understand that as a culture and invent laws and mechanisms to address that.
I didn't realize at the time how terrible family courts would be. I'd been warned that so many things would happen, such as false accusations, and they did happen. I obviously had my own allegations, so we had counter allegations, and everything seemed to get flipped on its head. And suddenly, in the family court, my allegations, even though they came first, started to be considered counter allegations or premeditated allegations.
But regardless of which stage it stops at, that false accusation said in a moment, perhaps just impulsively to a mother because you're trying to cover up the fact that you had sex. Whatever it is, it destroys that young man potentially forever. The suicide rate for these young men goes up. The stigma follows forever.
The graph is a hidden aspect of domestic violence. And what it shows is that men are 5 times more likely to suicide from domestic violence and abuse than women. You get a man in a desperate situation where he has to provide for his children and he is denied access to those children because of accusations of domestic violence that are false or unwarranted, et cetera, and that increases the depression. It becomes a vicious circle and ultimately can and often does lead to suicide.
I had all of these terrible accusations against me, and I hadn't seen my son at this time probably for 8 months or 12 months or something like this. And these thoughts I was having would be, I'd be driving down a motorway and I'd be like 70 miles an hour in the rain. I'd be like, I could just, jerk the steering wheel and crash my car and everything will be over. But every time I had these thoughts, I just kept thinking of my son.
As the women's movement became more and more powerful, and it's hugely powerful now, it became, in a way, almost like a bullying organization. And yes, an awful lot of everything got feminized, including the law courts and the judiciary.
With Empowering the Innocent, we are totally about equality feminism. Political feminism is so far away from that, and it's wicked, and it's dividing the entire of the West.
Every area of our social policy is essentially now controlled by senior female bureaucrats, and they have an enormous influence. And of course, they also run, the Australian Psychology Society. All the professional organisations have women at the top, and I would argue a lot of these women are feminists. A lot of these women are interested in promoting ideology rather than evidence-based approaches to whatever it is, whether it's the law or whether it's psychology, and they systematically bias things against men.
The original feminists would be shocked, appalled, and dismayed at the standard bearers of feminism now. It's no longer issues of fair divorce and child custody. It's now become a very overt anti-male, anti-family movement.
It's quite interesting in those days because there were huge holidays offered to women and children, single parent mothers, where they were told that they were the future, that men would be expendable, that men as fathers weren't necessary, and lots of studies to prove how well the children of single parent families did. Well, as we know now, 50 years later, that's not at all the truth.
Since the feminist revolution, women have been empowered to do anything a man can do, and fantastic, and that they're absolutely capable of that. However, women can always call on the sense of victimhood. If they do decide to claim that victimhood, they are much more likely to get a sympathetic response than a man in that position.
There's a total bias in our media in presenting all women as victims. I mean, that's the narrative. And so any challenge to that is downplayed, of course. Whenever a woman kills her children, there's a lot of soul searching in the media. What drove her to it? She must have had mental health problems, blah, 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 enormous sympathy. And when a man does something, a poor man, we've had some tragic cases in Australia where men sometimes end up killing themselves and their children. You're not allowed to say what drove him to it.
We fully support all initiatives that are targeting violence against women. However, all we're saying is that it happens to men too, and men should have the services and support as well.